the First Amendment specialist at Iowa State University, and I also teach classes in journalism. And so I'm proud to welcome our panelists here today. First of all, we have with us Jeffrey Hunt. Jeff is a media law attorney from Utah, but an Iowa State grad. So he's back on his home turf, if you will, and happy to join us. Jeff practices in the area of commercial litigation with a particular emphasis on First Amendment, media, and intellectual property. He is a nationally recognized expert and has represented every major news organization in the state of Utah, as well as many national organizations in addition to that. We also have sitting here in the room, Sara Konrad Baranowski. All right, and Sara is the editor of the twice weekly Iowa Falls Times Citizen newspaper. Before arriving in Iowa Falls in 2006, she worked as a reporter at the Fort Dodge Messenger, the West Liberty Index, and the Cedar Rapids Gazette. She has degrees from the University of Iowa and the University of Northern Iowa, where her interest in journalism was sparked in the offices of the student newspaper. And both of these individuals have bios that are far more extensive than I could cover here today, but I encourage you to go to their websites and learn more, and just trust that these are experts here with us today. Out in Zoom land, we have Randy Evans, and he is joining us from his remote location because his, I think, duty has called, right, Randy?
That's right.
And another meeting has come up, but Randy is the executive director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council, which is a 45-year-old nonpartisan, nonprofit education and advocacy organization that works for better government transparency and public accountability. Randy took over the role with the Freedom of Information Council in October of 2015 after working for 40 years at the Des Moines Register. He joined the Register in 1974, first as a news editor, news reporter, and then moving up the ranks and ultimately serving as the editor of the opinion pages during his final 4 years. So these are our panelists who are here today to talk to us about unmasking COVID secrets and how journalists fight for information. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. Don't wait until the end, because as I said, we need to wrap up right exactly on time. And also those of you on Zoom, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We do have someone monitoring those, and we'll make sure those questions get asked. All right, so without further ado, Randy, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind, and ask you to give us a brief overview of the Freedom of Information Act and how that works, so we have that for our context moving forward.
Sure. The Iowa, if you will, sunshine laws have been around for approximately 50 years. They've been modified at various times. One of the fundamental things that you ought to know about public records laws in Iowa is that it starts from the position that everything is a public record that is in the possession of government, unless there is an exemption someplace in the code of Iowa that makes it confidential, or that gives the lawful custodian of the records the ability to keep something confidential. And that's where we run afoul of the access to information during the COVID pandemic, was that government entities were saying, well, the law allows us to keep this confidential, or the way they typically would spin it is the law requires them to keep it confidential. But when you burrow down into it, you will see that the language in the statutes gives the government official the option to make information available when they think it's in the public interest. And that was so frustrating because during the pandemic, because if there was ever a time that the public was hungering for factual information, it was when we had the the biggest health crisis in a century. And yet too many governments went to their comfortable space of saying, oh, you can't have that. And, I think that that position was both annoying and frustrating for the people of Iowa who are wanting to know what's really going on.
Thank you. So that will bring us right into our topic, because you're right. This was the biggest health crisis that we've faced. So I'm going to ask Sara to share with us from her perspective on the front lines, some of the experiences you had in trying to report on this issue.
So as Julie said, I work at Twice Weekly newspaper, and one of my beats that I cover is the hospital. And so when COVID started, I had contacts at the hospital and with public health. And so it made sense for me to start reporting on it. And, nobody had really a chance to plan how we would report on COVID. It just happened and grew and grew. And so I just kind of waded into the pool of COVID reporting. And it was complicated and has always been complicated, maybe in ways that it didn't need to be. But initially, at least from my experience, I created a spreadsheet to try to keep track of the data that the state was putting out. The initial COVID website, which has changed, I don't even know, more than a dozen times over the last 2 years, provided information about cases and deaths and tests. And like I said, it changed what information was available and how it was presented. But I knew that I wanted to be able to reference, in 2 weeks, I want to be able to go back and see what the pandemic looked like at this point so that I could compare. Are we doing better? State's website was being updated. I wouldn't have that ability to do that. So really, it was just me trying to create a system so that I could report what was happening in Hardin County. That's our coverage area. And through that, I started to notice early in the pandemic that there were some issues with the data. So I would keep track of how many cases there were each day, and I'd update my spreadsheet and see that my numbers didn't match the states. And I thought maybe I was entering the data wrong, and spent many weeks figuring that I was doing it wrong. And I was taking screenshots to make sure that I was doing it correctly, and eventually realized that the state was changing numbers after the fact. So they were changing how many positive cases had been reported on a day 2 months prior, which shouldn't be happening. So that kind of, I think that's why I was invited to be on this panel, is because I eventually figured out that the state was backdating positive tests. They had a glitch in their system where if you tested negative on, say, March 30th, and then you were tested again on June 1st, and you tested positive, your positive was showing up on the March 30th date, not on the June 1st when you tested positive. So we weren't getting a true picture of the current pandemic, what it looked like on June 1st, because those cases were being backdated. And around this time, the state was also saying, well, we're going to base whether or not schools can close on a positivity rate. Well, that positivity rate wasn't correct because positive cases were being backdated. So just, like I say, when I waded into this pool, eventually I kind of felt like I got in over my head, but it was trying to get information from the state. And this kind of goes to the topic of today. I contacted the public information officer, or the spokesperson for the Iowa Department of Public Health, multiple times. They never answered my questions in a way that made sense. They said they were deduplicating tests, but that didn't explain the backdating. They wouldn't share additional information with me. Follow-up questions went completely unanswered. So really, it was just like I think Randy alluded to, it was frustrating and confusing, and just trying to report on something that I didn't totally understand myself. I couldn't explain it for a while until eventually the state said, oops, we had a glitch in our website. But even after that, getting data has been really hard. The state never released clear data. It was always run through their COVID website and presented in nice little graphics that looked great, but weren't entirely clear about the picture of the pandemic and what was happening. I don't know how much more detail you want. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into that later.
Yeah, no, that's helpful to kind of get that picture of what your specific situation was. And maybe we'll just ask Jeff to jump in next and kind of build on that. What's been your perspective in Utah or in general when it comes to journalists trying to get access to information?
Sure. Thank you, Julie, and thank you for allowing me to participate on the panel with Randy and Sara. It's good to be back on campus. In fact, this room, I think, is the very room that we put the Iowa State Daily out in when I was here on campus. Gary and I were talking about this. This used to be the Daily office, and my office was in that corner, so it's kind of a fun trip down memory lane. But on COVID, Utah's story is very similar to Iowa. So we have a statute, sounds like very similar to Iowa's, where all government records are presumed to be open to the public, unless there's an express exception in the code. And even then, if there is an exception, the law provides that a chief administrative officer of a government entity or the records committee of the state or a court can balance the interests for and against access, and if the public interest weighs in favor of access, release a record that's even classified as non-public. So that's where we start from. And our story in Utah started with a Facebook page that Utah County has. So it's their official Facebook page for the county. Utah County is a county south of Salt Lake County, where Brigham Young University is. It's a fairly large college population. And they posted on the county website that there was an outbreak, COVID outbreak at 2 businesses in Utah County that had flouted the COVID guidelines. This was a time very early in the pandemic when there was great transmission of the virus through Utah, and there were these regulations regarding not allowing sick workers in the workplace. Testing had to be done, spacing, of course. And the county put this out and said, you know, this is a bad example. They had one business that had over 50% of the workers came down with COVID. The other, a third of them came down with COVID. And one of the allegations that the health department was investigating was one of the businesses made sick employees work. They knew that they had COVID and they were telling them to work. So just kind of a terrible situation. And of course, the report caught the eye of the reporters, and the reporters said, we want to know who these businesses are. So the public has a right to know if these people are violating the county guidelines, who they are, so they stay away from them, for one thing, and they for their own safety, health and safety. And the county refused to provide the information. So it's kind of astonishing that they'd make this big splash saying we're cracking down on these businesses, but then not say who they were. And the reason that they gave was that there was a statute in Utah that said that the identity of someone who has a communicable disease is private information, okay, which makes sense. The county investigates health outbreaks, virus outbreaks, and the identity of the specific individuals are private. And we can all understand that, but we weren't asking, our media clients weren't asking for the names of the individuals, they were asking for the names of the businesses. And the argument was, well, if we tell you the names of the businesses, because they're small, relatively small, people will be able to find out who the people are, which made no sense because these were businesses. They had 100 employees at one business and over 50 in the other. So you're talking about, you know, a large number of people. And so they said, sorry, we're not going to give you the information. So at that point in Utah, it's a tough situation because you can go through the litigation process, and the average time to resolve an open records lawsuit in Utah is about a year. So you file a lawsuit, the other side gets to file their response. You have maybe some discovery briefing, you get a court date, and it's 9 months to a year down the road before you get the information. This was an emergency health situation. So we, one of the challenges, of course, with our news clients in Utah, and I imagine here in Iowa and across the country, is lack of money to pay for legal battles. And so we agreed to take this on a very I called low bono, not pro bono basis, a very modest fee. And we got the Utah Media Coalition to come on board. It's very similar, it sounds like, to your Utah or your Iowa Freedom of Information Council. So we got the whole weight of the media. We filed a lawsuit. We asked the judge to expedite the lawsuit, and the judge did. We were fortunate to get a really great judge down in Utah County who understood the importance of this case. She expedited the briefing. We got an argument, I believe, within 3 weeks. And within a month, she had ruled in our favor that the statute did not apply because it only applied to individuals. Naming the businesses would not identify the individuals. The public had a right to know these businesses that were violating the law. And so we got the records. And the really interesting thing with the records is we identified the businesses, so they were able to report who the businesses were, and they had to suffer the consequences of their violating the law. But what we also got was a lot of internal emails between the health department workers about these outbreaks. And some of those emails were saying things like, oh, yeah, stay away from Built Bar. They just had 50% of their employees, contracted COVID. And so they're like warning each other to stay away. So they're protecting their own health and the health of their families, but not the public. It's just like the hypocrisy of that is just astonishing to me. So it was a great result. We're fortunate to have a great judge that pushed it along, and the public benefited. But I think it illustrates what Sara and Randy are talking about, this sort of reflexive response of government to say, well, if you want it, there must be a reason why I shouldn't give it to you. And it's always a challenge in every open records case, not just COVID related.
Interesting. Randy, what are you seeing from your perspective statewide when it comes to trying to access information about COVID? Sorry.
Doing their darndest to be able to tell their viewers and readers what the picture was in their particular area. But here it quickly became a matter of common sense was very uncommon. There was one newspaper that was asking for how many tests had been performed at the local government hospital. It was a county government hospital. So we didn't have any issues with a private nonprofit that owned the hospital. How many tests, COVID tests, have been performed, and what was the result? And the response was that they couldn't provide that because it was protected under HIPAA, the medical privacy federal law. And I said, well, you tell people how many babies you deliver every year, and you don't consider that being protected by HIPAA. So why would the number of COVID tests be protected? And it quickly devolved from there. We had, I heard of reporters who were frustrated trying to find out, how many, when the National Guard was mobilized to expedite the delivery of testing materials, ventilators, and other medical supplies. People wanted to know how many units of whatever was being delivered, and where were they going. They weren't looking for the street address, and the response was, oh no, the laws that protect critical infrastructure and that those sort of assets, we can't tell you that. But again, this is not somebody who's looking for an address so that they can go in and sweep in and steal the ventilators. But that unfortunately was all too common. And you know, I would attribute that to, let me just start by saying, I don't think that transparency and access to government records is a political issue. It's not a Democratic issue or Republican issue. It's an issue of who is in power or who is in office and who is not. But I think that the attitude of governments in Iowa during the pandemic was being colored by the governor's staff, where people were making public records requests and nothing was happening. They weren't getting a response. Not only were they not getting records, they weren't even getting that's a confidential record, or we'll get that to you quickly, or we're backed up. There was no response at all. And I think that the inability of government to respond to public records requests during a health crisis of this magnitude is a stunning indictment of the government's competency. If government is not able to respond to requests for public records during a pandemic, when the public's appetite and hunger for information is the greatest, it's just it's very frustrating. And that's one of the reasons that myself and the FOI Council have a lawsuit that is pending against the governor over the refusal to respond in a timely manner to legitimate requests for public records. I think we were trying to find that balancing point in there where, recognizing that the government had an incredible job on its hands to deal with the pandemic, so we weren't, being unreasonable, I don't think, in how quickly we were expecting a response. But it became obvious that, the strategy was, if you want it, sue us, and maybe then we will make records available. And within 2 weeks of our lawsuit being filed, suddenly there were requests for records that were being acted upon that there had been no movement on them in more than a year. So, the performance of government has just been very frustrating. And I think that, some of the problems that have occurred around Iowa and in other states can be attributed to the foot dragging that goes on. The public doesn't have access to the information they want and they need.
Picking up on what Randy is talking about with the delays and the frustrations, what's been your experience, not just with COVID, but before that? Like, was there a change when COVID happened in your work of obtaining records?
So there's, I don't know, because before COVID, I didn't have a lot of reasons to contact state government to ask for records. I would often contact county or local government with whom I have good relationships and they know me. So I can't say, I don't feel like I can say accurately whether the state government's attitude about public records changed. Throughout the pandemic, I've had more success with accessing local records than state records. I had a good relationship with our county public health department, and they were helpful, and they were just as frustrated as I was because they were getting either no information from the state. The governor would go and have a press conference and announce something, and they wouldn't know that she was going to announce that they were now going to do something. Or they were also seeing the backdating problems and couldn't explain them. And that's been, I talked to the public health coordinator a couple of months ago, and she was still saying that she's frustrated with the ways things have been going. And I don't know that I've ever run into an issue or an instance where a government official or government officials have been as unresponsive as they were during COVID. And like Randy said, I tried for weeks to just talk to someone at the Iowa Department of Public Health, and I would call and I would email repeatedly, and my phone calls were never returned. The public or the spokesperson who was employed at the Department of Public Health in 2020 never called me back, and she would only email, and it would be 2 sentences, and then I'd send a quick reply and say, well, I would want to follow up with this, and then I would never get a reply, which is just inexcusable. I mean, you're a spokesperson and I have a question and I'm trying to clarify information and you can't reply to me. Eventually, the backdating issue, I don't think ever would have come to light if there's a nurse practitioner who works at the University of Iowa, and she was tracking data on her own, like a lot of people in Iowa were. And she noticed the issue, and instead of going through the public information or the PR office, she submitted a question through, a lot of government websites say, do you have a question? Submit it here. And she did. And somehow that question was forwarded to an epidemiologist who then replied to her and said, you're right, we've noticed there is a problem with our data tracking and we're trying to fix it. Whereas I was going the route that they want reporters to go and getting nothing. So I don't know, maybe I've learned that I should just submit my question via the portal, but it just shows that, they knew that there was a problem. The epidemiologist said there was a problem, but I couldn't get any kind of answer, or I was getting answers to questions I wasn't asking. And it's just, it breeded, I don't know, it gave me no confidence in their transparency or ability to answer questions. And I can't report or feel like I'm reporting accurately. So it was this weird situation where I was having to write in my stories that, well, the state says there were 20 new cases this week, but data show that there were 30, so it's not exactly clear. And so I'm kind of passing that ambiguity on to our audience, our newspaper's audience, and that wasn't helping anyone, because then the people who already believed that COVID was made up or was worse or better than, or not as bad as the government was saying, were just convinced that it was all made up. So it was a big mess.
Yeah, Cooper.
Do you think this is an issue that's kind of specific or inherent to a pandemic like this, where case numbers are tracking and changing every day, or is it kind of a larger issue that with information that's kind of systemic or inherent to government, trying to track that information and coordinate it across state agencies?
So personally, I'll answer first because it looked like you were asking.
Yeah.
And Randy might have an answer to this also, but I think that there are 2 things. First of all, the state's disease tracking software was outdated and needed to be updated. Mm-hmm. So I don't think anyone maliciously said we're going to screw up the way that we're reporting these numbers. But I also think that there's been, and like Randy said, I don't think it's a political issue, but I think it's kind of an attitude of, whereas our public records laws should be that everything is available to the public unless it specifically says it shouldn't be. I think there's a tendency to want to hold more private or keep more away from the public, unless people kind of make a stink about it. I don't know. That's the skeptic in me, though.
Does anyone have speculation on why that is? Is it just something that is kind of inherent to power, or is it? I don't know. It's kind of a hard question to answer. It's very broad. But
why would government not want to give out information?
What is kind of that hoarding mindset when it comes to information?
Well, I think in Utah, they probably didn't want anyone to get their emails where they were letting each other know about outbreaks. There are things that are said in emails, government emails, that they don't want to be public because it would make them look bad. I don't know. Maybe the other panelists have some insight into that.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. Don't want to reveal the incompetence or what's going on behind the scenes. Some of it is information is power. They just want to hold on to that. In Utah, it was the dichotomy and the conflict was between the state epidemiologist and the health professionals and the legislature. So the legislature is a Republican-dominated legislature, and you had the science people. The science people wanted the data out there, push it out there, and the legislators were, let's get back to business. Let's get people back in the kids back in the schools, people back in the offices, and so there was this huge tension there between what the health professionals were advising and what the politicians wanted to do. And I think that skewed a lot of the data. It skewed when it was released. There would be times when the test results would sort of back up for maybe a day or two, and then there would be, they would get dumped into the system on the state dashboard, and the numbers would go up. So it would be like, it looked like it was a big increase, but if you flattened it out over when those tests were done, it really wasn't that great. And the epidemiologist would explain all of that, but the legislators were just always on her back and howling about that. And so eventually she left and went to Salt Lake County. Salt Lake County is sort of like Austin in Texas. So it's this bastion of blue and a sea of red. And so they were making decisions based on the science, and she had a home there. But it's unfortunate that it got politicized that way. And that was really the conflict.
Second, Anna. Randy, do you have anything you'd like to add to this thought on sort of the philosophy behind open records?
I think we have seen a change that precedes the pandemic on the access to and the availability of government records. Technology has made record keeping a whole lot easier than it was in the days of file folders and paper documents, where if you wanted to find something, some clerk was going to have to go through, a file drawer trying to find the document you want. Digital documents now, you plug in, some keywords and up pops the document. But we're not seeing public records being much more easy to access, even before the pandemic. And I think part of it is, the government leaders know who the chief executive of the state is, and they want to remain in good standing. And, the staff of governors are concerned about staying on message, and sometimes records maybe go against that message. The public information officer for the Iowa Department of Public Health for more than 10 years was either fired or forced out, or it's being litigated right now, because she was being too accommodating when journalists were asking for records. The reporter for the Des Moines Register asked for the records of the number of abortions that had been performed in Iowa in a certain span of time after the legislature cut Planned Parenthood off from money for family planning. State money has never gone to pay for abortions, but there would be one side that would make the case that because less money was going into family planning, there were more unplanned pregnancies, and the increase in the number of abortions might be connected there somehow. And this story in the Des Moines Register raised the hackles within state government, because the legislature, Republican dominated, and the governor, a Republican, had pushed this measure to cut off Planned Parenthood from family planning assistance. and there were consequences, and the public information officer lost her job. But I think that's indicative of this whole concept of messaging, and it goes against the message sometimes, that which is contained in records, and it's unfortunate that we're at that stage, because I've been around since Jesus was an intern, and in my early years at the Des Moines Register, I could call the press secretary to the governor at home at night, and before the evening was over, I would have the information I was looking for. And now you can't even get that person to answer the telephone during office hours. And I don't think things are going to change until the citizens stand up and say, we deserve better. The government belongs to us. It doesn't belong to the government officials. But I think that's where the change is going to come, is because the public is going to demand change. It's not going to come because journalists want it, or the opposition party wants it.
Question.
I guess kind of going off of that, mentioning that the public really has to push for a change in these sort of things. But throughout your time working with government, have you noticed an increase of them kind of figuring out like, oh, we need to be doing this, or this is how we should work with journalists? Have you seen that at all since this has been our first pandemic in a lifetime? Or do you think if hopefully we don't have another pandemic anytime soon, do you think that they'd be more prepared to head into that while working with you, or have you not seen any sort of change? Maybe that's too preemptive, but
I don't know. I don't want to think about.
Hold on, Randy, just a second.
Randy wanted to.
No, go
Okay.
right ahead.
I was just going to say, I think, again, I'll go back to the difference between the state officials and local. I think local, I built stronger relationships with, and they saw us as a way to get information out to the public, which we absolutely are. Factual information. And I think they saw us that way before, but now even more, because they were able to call us or email us, like Randy said, at any time of the day, and we would answer, and we would help them get their message out, or let people know where there were going to be vaccines available. State government, I don't know. I really don't think they would change the way that they responded. I think that they believe, governor's office believes, that they did everything they needed to do and should have done to respond to the pandemic. I don't think that they see it as flawed. Maybe Randy has a different opinion. No, I bet he agrees with me. But, so I don't have confidence that they would act differently with the current people that are there. But now don't show any signs of any kind of response, even if it gets worse again. So I just don't have confidence, really. Randy? Really?
Well,
Randy?
I think Sara hit the nail on the head, that I see a clear difference between government officials at the local government level and those at the state government level. And I think one of the reasons in it is just common sense, that the person who is, whether they're the public health director or the county auditor or whatever the job is that they have, they're bumping into their constituents every day when they gas up their car, when they're in the supermarket, wherever they are, they're bumping into constituents. And I could point you to, government officials at the local level who say, the taxpayers have paid for these records. They belong to you. So, if it's not going to take hours of my staff's time, whatever you want, we'll make you the copies, and we're not going to charge you for them. And you don't see that everywhere. And, when the farther removed you are from the citizens, the easier it is to lose track of that connection.
I think Barrett, who used to be the governor's chief of staff and I think is now working on her campaign, I think that's right, tweeted out that there had been some study that showed that Iowa and maybe Utah also had handled the pandemic the best. Like California had done it the worst and New York had done it the worst. And if you looked at the study, it was produced by a definitely a Republican funded right-wing organization that had political motives. So, I mean, the fact that Pat Garrett tweeted this out and said, look, this proves that we did everything right, I think shows that they believe they did everything right. And I think a lot of their supporters say, yep, you did a great job. So like Randy said, they aren't seeing the people that their actions are affecting the most on a daily basis. So
what we've done in Utah, to your point, is tried to develop relationships with the sort of lobbying groups for the government. So we have the Utah Association of Counties, Utah League of Cities and Towns. So these are like government sort of interest groups. And they have conventions, they have seminars, they have training. And about 20 years ago, we started reaching out to them saying, hey, we'd like to participate in your training, because I think a lot of it in the hinterlands of Utah is inadequate training. They don't understand what our open records statute requires, and they're intimidated by it. It's complicated. They don't have the legal resources to train. So we show up every year, sometimes twice a year, at their conventions, their seminars, and present training. We have journalists on the panel to talk about their specific needs and how it works as a reporter trying to get information. So building those bridges with the local governments, and we do the same with the state agencies, has really made a difference, because they don't view us just as an adversary. They view us more as someone trying to get information out to the public and not a threat. So that's helped. One thing I would like to say, a positive that came out of the pandemic, was meetings. So we were having virtual government meetings and legislative meetings before, but you always had to have an anchor location. And unless you were a member of the public, you couldn't participate virtually unless you were at the anchor location. When the pandemic hit, there was lockdown. There were no anchor locations. And so government had to scramble to figure out how we have government meetings in a virtual world. And the courts were doing the same thing. There were no in-person court hearings. So the courts were grappling with the technology and figuring out, okay, we can connect the judge with the lawyers and the criminal defendants in the jail on Zoom. We have to have a public access portal and a portal for the reporters. And so they were scrambling. It took them a little while to figure it out. And there were some glitches, but now, I mean, you can have a reporter down in southern Utah cover a court case, a federal case or a state case up in Salt Lake City. Doesn't have to travel, 250 miles. And it's been a great tool for increased access. And I think it's going to stick. I think that we're going to have more maybe hybrid type government meetings and court proceedings, but that's been a real plus for access.
Randy, you may want to talk about that.
I would second what Jeff said. I think that it's hard to see something good in a disease that's killed nearly 1 million people. But I think it has opened the eyes of government on ways that they can be more accessible to the public. The technology has been made available in short order. The courts in Iowa, you can sit anywhere in Iowa and watch a public court proceeding as a journalist or as a citizen that is on Zoom. You can sit anywhere in Iowa and watch it in any of the 99 counties. Unfortunately, I think there are some instances when government is reverting back to its old ways. I appeared before a board of supervisors in Sara's backyard, where the board during the pandemic had met by Zoom. People could tune in to the meeting from their tractors or their their businesses. One of the county supervisors who was mobilized by the National Guard was in the Middle East and was attending meetings via Zoom from the Middle East. But once he got back to Iowa, and the governor started, winding down some of the emergency proclamations that had been issued because of the pandemic, the county went back to its old ways, where if you wanted to follow what the supervisors were doing, you had to show up at 9 o'clock in the morning. And it was interesting that the day that I was there to make the case for why they ought to continue to offer Zoom access, and the supervisors were giving me that kind of, come on, let's move it along, get over it. There was an insurance agent from some nearby town who was trying to sell them disability insurance for county employees, and the supervisors allowed this salesperson to zoom in and make her sales pitch. So it was convenient for government, but whether it is convenient for the citizens to be able to have that was immaterial.
Unfortunately, we are at the end of our time already. This is such a critically important conversation to continue. I do want to thank the panelists, Jeff, Sara, and Randy, for joining us today and for sharing information. I want to thank the students and others in the audience here and those of you on Zoom. As I mentioned before, this session is recorded and we will post it to our First Amendment Days website. And we do have one more session to go. So if you are able, please jump on our next Zoom meeting. And otherwise, have a great rest of your weekend. And thank you again, everybody.